Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
So glad you're with us for the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Thanks so much to Craig Collins for filling in for me on Thursday and Friday. Great vacation, but Jim, always good to be back with you. And we have 3 martinis today, and I'm glad you had 3 good ones with Craig on Friday because we don't have any good ones today. But that's the way the ball bounces some days. But let's start with our first martini. It's bad. In case you haven't looked closely at your calendar today, it's October 7th. That means it's been 1 year since the unspeakable Hamas terrorist attacks against Israel that we all woke up to last year on a Saturday morning and realizing the atrocities that had happened in community after community, people being slaughtered, women being raped, people being abducted. There are still hostages. So many have died in custody. We just lost an American not that long ago. And weirdly, on the world stage in response to this, there was compassion for Israel for, I don't know, few weeks maybe, and then the anti-Semitism came pouring out across the UN, as it always does. College campuses rampant in this country and other places around the world. Jim, the leadership in this country had very little patience for it, despite good statements early on. And a year later, what's changed for the good, what's changed for the bad, and what's still up in the air?
Well, first of all, we always welcome new listeners, but I really hope this is not your first episode of the Three Martini Lunch you've ever listened to, because Greg and I pride ourselves on being jovial, cheery, often funny guys talking about the day's events, and unsurprisingly today, I just can't bring myself to be funny. There's just nothing. There's nothing funny about this. I ran an errand this morning before we started taping. There is a Lubavitch synagogue not too far from my home in what I call Authenticity Woods, and there was a cop car out front. Nothing had happened. Lights weren't flashing. It's just the kind of precaution they need to have on October 7th. And while we could talk about the silver lining, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Iranian state are all in worse shape now than they were on October 6, 2023. It's been a long, hard road to get there, and it's come at great cost to the Israeli people. And the other thing that I wrote about today in the Morning Jolt, just kind of focusing on, my colleagues had focused on every conceivable angle, but there was one that I felt like it hadn't been discussed. And what did we learn in the last year? Well, we learned that the world is full of people who hate Jews, and we learned that the United States has no shortage of people who enthusiastically cheer on those who want to kill Jews. Unfortunately, a lot of college campuses. And I went down the list because I'm not saying the Israeli government never deserves criticism. But I'm just going to point out, we live in a world in which Chinese genocide against the Uyghurs, that's documented. That's going on. That's straight up there. UN reports, every international organization, U.S. State Department, that's genocide going on. I don't see many college protesters rising up and demanding that China stop doing this. Listeners know the Ukrainian cause is near and dear to my heart. Don't hear a lot of protests on college campuses about that. You maybe get a little bit here. The Taliban, you can find Sudan, you can go down the list. And in Myanmar, there are actual, indisputable genocides going on in a half dozen places all around the world right now. That doesn't seem to interest many college students on American campuses. Israel, that does. Now, here's a question. Is Israel hammering Hamas and Hezbollah and all these folks? No doubt about it. Does it meet the standard of genocide? Not even close. The existence of civilian casualties does not make something a genocide. But you can't explain that to American college, at least the vocal minority of American college students. We should point out something like 89% of all American students said they had not participated in a protest for or against Israel. There are a whole bunch of kids in the library studying, doing what they're supposed to be doing. But obviously, a very noisy and sometimes violent faction of American college students have turned this, in their minds, into the single most important crusade, perhaps an ironic word choice, the single most important movement of our time is denouncing Israel for its military actions of self-defense against enemies who carried out a massacre and just last week launched more than 200 ballistic missiles at them. Right? That's what gets them angry. How dare you, Israel, defend yourself? And I just walked down the list and I point out all these examples. If you wanted to protest Putin or Xi Jinping or the Taliban, my guess is your typical college campus there's no representation of the Taliban on your college campus. There's no representation. I didn't realize how much they had shut down the Confucius Institutes, although there's still a lot of Chinese money flowing into American campuses. There probably isn't any representation of the Russian government or Russian culture on a lot of college campuses. But Greg, you know what almost every college campus has?
Jewish students and faculty.
That and a Hillel. A nice big location. You might as well paint a great big bullseye on it. And oh, by the way, the Anti-Defamation League says there have been a couple hundred attacks on, graffiti, threatening messages, bomb threats, and in like 20-some cases, assaults on Jewish students, right? If you hate Israel, you can find a Jewish student. And that, to me, is the revealing point in which you say, no, this is not anti-Zionism. You're not really protesting the actions of the Israeli government. You just hate Jews because that Jewish student, you don't even know what their viewpoint is. The only thing that mattered to you is that they're Jewish. So don't tell me that this is all about protesting it. This is all standing up for Palestinians. Don't tell me this is about standing up for human rights in far off lands. I just listed 6 that you've never cared about. But the moment Israel gets involved, then you're out on the quad, wearing your keffiyeh, waving your Palestinian flag. So, as you can tell, this has made me the anniversary has made me very dyspeptic. I think we have learned just how deep this is and just how socially accepted anti-Semitism is when you say you're doing it in opposition to the government of Israel.
Yes, and it's been, part of the pattern at the United Nations for a long time, the terrorist strike, and tisk tisk, he probably shouldn't have done that. Israel responds, and then they get denounced with a dozen, UN resolutions that the U.S. usually has to veto. And so it's a complete double standard. And don't forget that Israel's entire operation is the result of the terrorist attacks. So Hamas bears responsibility for this, not to mention that the overwhelming majority of the civilian casualties are because Hamas, or Hezbollah in certain cases, keeps their munition stockpiles, keeps their weapons that they are firing in civilian locations and neighborhoods and hospitals and wherever. We've had to correct so many different things about Israel deliberately targeting hospitals and other civilian situations. And then once more information comes out, that's what was happening. And so it's not that mistakes haven't been made, but the idea that Israel is deliberately targeting the civilian population is untrue. So, Jim, last week in Virginia, there was a U.S. Senate debate between Tim Kaine, who's seeking a third term, Democrat, obviously, against the Republican challenger, Hung Cao. Hung Cao, an impressive guy, ran for the House 2 years ago and narrowly lost in a district that most Republicans would have lost by a lot. And he's also a longtime military veteran. His family's Vietnamese refugees. Powerful story. But he was talking about the situation in the Middle East and how the Biden administration got real wobbly when it comes to Israel not that long after the 10/7 attacks. And so here's what he said in the debate last week. And I think a lot of this rings true.
I want to ask everybody if you knew what happened on October 7th, 2001. That's the day we invaded Afghanistan because they took down the Twin Towers. Nobody at that time could have told us, hey, take it easy on the Taliban. When they come in the middle of the night and they kill 1,200 people and they rape women and young girls and they throw babies in ovens, there should be no mercy. And when you talk about either Hamas, Hezbollah, or the Houthis, they're all Iranian proxies. And why is Iran so emboldened now? Because they lifted up all the sanctions and they gave them all the money. So they have all the money in the world right now to wage war against us. Look, as a warrior, I'm the last person that wants to get back into war. I've been in war for 20 years. I fought in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. The difference is that we have to stand by Israel. And he has basically held off on some of the weapons that are going to Israel, saying, no offensive weapons. We can't tell them how to do things. I saw that in Vietnam when they said, hey, let's not, it's like giving guns without ammunition. That's exactly what we're doing over there. And that's the difference. I will stand by our allies all the time.
So I think you can certainly dispute certain policies of your allies from time to time. I don't think it's just a blanket affirmation all the time. But in general, you stand by your allies. And I think he's right about the rules of engagement. So frustrating in Vietnam, it's frustrating in Afghanistan. You got to let your allies in this case do, in general, what needs to be done to get it done. And so ever since, Jim, a few weeks, couple months into the Israeli response in Gaza, the basic Biden administration position has been, okay, that's probably enough.
Take the win, as they emphasized after the barrage of rockets that Iran launched at Israel in April, which led to another barrage of rockets last week. When they can keep doing it over and over again, it doesn't feel like much of a win.
No, not at all. So good on Hung Cao to articulate that. I'm not super optimistic about his Senate race in Virginia, but nonetheless, you got a couple of viral moments out of it. And politics these days, that does matter. But in terms of the 1 year anniversary, a very sobering 12 months that we've been through, but a revealing 12 months as well. All right, time for our first great sponsor today, and that is ZBiotics. Look, whether it's the stress of the election coming down to the final few weeks here, or what we just talked about in the situation with the Middle East, sometimes you need a stiff drink at the end of the day, but always take ZBiotics first, because as long as you're drinking responsibly, your next morning will be just fine, as long as your first drink is ZBiotics.
ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in your gut. And it's this byproduct, not dehydration, that is to blame for your rough next morning. ZBiotics pre-alcohol produces an enzyme that breaks this byproduct down. So just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly, as always, and you will feel your best the next morning.
As I've mentioned many times, I've got a colleague at Radio America, always drank responsibly, but as he got older, felt a little bit worse in the mornings. Tried ZBiotics, felt great ever since. Go to zbiotics.com/3ml to get 15% off your first order when you use 3ml at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantees, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Visit zbiotics.com/3ml and use the code 3ml at checkout for 15% off. Thank you, ZBiotics, for sponsoring this episode and our good times. All right, Jim, on to our second bad martini now, and this is definitely one of those we told you so bad martinis. We're always happy to see Americans come home when they've been unjustly imprisoned overseas, and that includes Brittney Griner over there in Russia. She actually did have the cannabis oil, which is against the law there, but the punishment was incredibly egregious. But then, in Bergdahl-like fashion, the Biden administration decides to trade infamous, notorious arms dealer Viktor Bout for Brittney Griner. Well, Brittney Griner's back at work in the WNBA, and Viktor Bout, sadly, is back at work now as well. The Wall Street Journal with the reporting. Here's the Fox News story on that report. Viktor Bout, the notorious Russian arms dealer, released in a prisoner exchange for Brittney Griner, is now attempting to broker arms deals with Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen. Bout, known as the Merchant of Death, now serves as a local politician. In Vladimir Putin's party, he has reportedly returned to the arms trade as well, negotiating with Houthi representatives who visited Moscow in August to purchase some $10 million worth of small arms. While the shipment has not been delivered, an arms deal between Moscow and the Houthis, a U.S.-designated terrorist group, represents an escalation of tensions by Putin. And I'm sure, Jim, you'll love further down in the article that the lawyer for Viktor Bout here in the United States says Bout making arms deals with the Houthis is no different than the U.S. providing weapons to Ukraine. So in terms of the I told you so factor, this is not a surprise. It's a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10 at least. And so not only is Viktor Bout back in the game, but it shows that Iran and Russia might be getting tighter than ever.
Let's point out that Bout's lawyer refers to the gun running as the transportation business, yes. Which is kind of like when you're shipping cocaine and you're saying, I've got fine Colombian coffee coming over here. Coupled with the fact that he says, look, it is absolutely, he's not involved. He hasn't been involved in 20 years. Yes, because he was in prison for a decade. That's part of it. Right. But he also says, look, even if he was, it's no different than, NATO shipping arms to Ukraine. I think there's a little bit of a difference. Look, during the whole Griner prisoner exchange or trade between the U.S. and Russia, those of us who raised objections, or not even raised objections, just pointed out that if you reward bad behavior, you will get more bad behavior. Putin was getting what he wanted out of this. Ergo, we should expect more Americans to get arrested under nonsense terms. And look what happened to Evan Gersovich not too long after that. Like basically, we had this second massive prisoner trade in which they got a whole bunch of guys from Germany and a bunch of our European allies all had to let out prisoners, including one guy who had straight up executed a guy in a park in front of a family with children. But he gets to go back to Russia. This is like the old poem, Paying the Danegeld, right? When you pay someone, you give someone they want for doing something bad to you, you are only creating a system in which they're going to come back and do it more. If someone does something bad to you, you have to do something bad back. Otherwise, they're just going to want to do more of it. And there was this emotional blackmail that for those of us who pointed out, it says, look, Viktor Bout, like, he was literally like the embodiment of evil by our own State Department, right? This is the guy who Nicolas Cage played in that movie Lord of War a couple of years. He is the most single notorious arms dealer on the planet. If there was a genocide, if there was a junta, if there was some sort of group that was running around slaughtering civilians, there was a decent chance that Viktor Bout had armed these guys. And we let him out of jail. We gave him back to Russia. At the time, a couple of people who had written biographies of Bout had said, look, he's an old man. He's not. His contacts are probably out of date. He's not going to go back to this. This trade is worthwhile. Well, here we are. Lo and behold, you don't need good knees to be an arms dealer. Go figure. It's not like the NBA. It's not like, at some point you get too old to do the job anymore. He's back in business. He's doing it. The first one was for AK-74. By the way, it's not a typo. AK-74s are a type of Russian rifle. They're kind of like the AK-47. They're just bigger and more extensive. Oh, by the way, somebody pointed out as an error in one of my novels, and it irked me in the Amazon review. Yes, there is such a thing as an AK-74. But anyway, but they're also talking about potential anti-tank weapons and anti-aircraft missiles and things like that. So that's what he's back in business. And we were assured, he's too old. The harm, this was a necessary deal. Well, the harm is more significant than we were told at the time. My sneaking suspicion is the Biden administration just wants the happy headlines when the when American hostages are reunited with their families, and they'll worry about the problem later. Well, welcome to later. They kicked the can down the road, and now we are here, and we're dealing with the world's most notorious arms dealer back in business.
So, yes, once again, absolutely fleeced in the hostage negotiating table. Doesn't mean we're not happy the Americans are home. But in terms of the people that have been released, some of the worst trades you've ever seen. If you're an NFL general manager, you'd be fired immediately. All right, brand new sponsor today, 3 Martini Lunch, is sponsored by BetterHelp. Look, we talk all the time about the mental health crisis in this country. We've got kids, whether it's affected by the pandemic or more, or social media and trends and peer pressure. They are struggling, many of them, with their mental health. And it's not just kids, it's adults too. You see reports all the time about parents being stressed out and the work and home balance and so many other things. And so a lot of people need help getting through those challenges. For those who still are looking for help, BetterHelp. BetterHelp is professional. All the therapists are licensed, accredited professionals, and allows you to connect with them in a safe and convenient online environment. It's affordable. You just pay a low flat fee for both live sessions as well as messaging with your therapist. And therapy doesn't have to be expensive. It's also convenient. Do it at your own time and at your own pace. Take the mask off with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/3ML today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Martini. All right, Jim, on to our crazy martini now. We do need a little levity today, so thank you for staying with us through the more sobering first and second martinis. Late last week, Kamala Harris was on the campaign trail. I'm sure the stump speech has been tweaked to incorporate whatever's been said or controversies that have erupted in recent days. But for the most part, your basic stump speech doesn't change a whole lot, especially when you're Kamala Harris and you're really not interested in a lot of specifics on things. So she was speaking late last week. And apparently, Jim, as you'll learn in this clip, at that point, there were 32 days until Election Day. And that's when the teleprompter conked out for about 45 seconds. And let's just say Kamala's extemporaneous ability, her impromptu ability, not great.
Today we got 32 days until the election.
That's where it went out.
So 32 days. 32 days. Okay, we got some business to do. All right. 32 days. And we know we will do it. And this is going to be a very tight race until the very end. We are the underdog, and we know we have some hard work ahead.
Jim, that's painful. I don't even like Kamala Harris. That's painful. Just repeat 32 days, hoping that it'll conk right back in. And when it didn't, she just starts coming up with a couple extra phrases to repeat over and over again. By this point, you should know your basic message. If you can't riff a little bit, that's not good.
Greg, I counted 4 32s in there. O.J. Simpson didn't hear 32 chanted that often. Then the 2 very tight races in there. I really think one could have done it. Now, listeners, I know this is an audio pilot. These are the hand-scribbled notes that I use before the 3 Martini lunch, if I bother to do so. And I know people are like, Jim, we can tell you guys ad lib. We can tell by the sheer number of ahs you put in every single answer that you do. But you know, you and I aren't even running for president, and we can ad lib at considerable length, probably too long, over and over again, because most days we're talking about something we have a reasonable amount of familiarity with, and you'd like to think at this point Kamala Harris has some familiarity with running for president against Donald Trump. You would think, or what she's actually I shouldn't be too angry at her for not knowing what she's running about, or what she's running on, or what her agenda is, because she just never tells anybody, and it's she gets stumped by that in a lot of interviews. People have Ted Kennedy. By the way, I just want to point out, it's like we're now 3 minutes in, and I have completely ad-libbed this, and I can do this. So Kamala Harris, why can't you do? Why is this hard? No one's saying, if you got the Tim Walz question, and all right, what's wrong with this carburetor? Then you would have a good legitimate reason to be tap dancing and having a tough time. This is the middle of your stump speech. This is about and everyone there's happy to see you. There's nobody who's there who's skeptical. This is the friendliest audience you're going to get. Okay, so I could ad lib for another 20 minutes on this podcast to prove my point, but probably people have things to do with their day. So I will pause here and just point out that when if somebody had said, Greg Corombos, what is wrong with the Chicago Bears throughout their history? You could do a 3-hour podcast, just nonstop. When you know what you're talking about, it's not hard to talk about it at length. What does it say that Kamala Harris can't talk about anything once the teleprompter, goes on the fritz?
Exactly. And your basic order, so you should know what subject comes next. And even if you don't, your teleprompter person should be able to catch up with you fairly quickly. And so just the deer in the headlights look. And it's not just that. We saw it at the debate when she got questions she didn't want to answer directly. We see it in just about every interview.
Her tough schedule with Call Me Daddy, Oprah, Stephen Colbert. Like somebody said, could you do an interview with someone who hasn't endorsed you? Is it really too much to ask?
Yeah, well, she finally did one with 60 Minutes, who hasn't officially endorsed her, but let's be honest on which side they're on. And one of the questions was, let's live in reality here. You want to raise taxes on the rich. You're not going to have the votes to do that. Oh, no, I know people secretly want to hike taxes on the rich, even in the Republican Party. Really? Come on. You don't know what you're talking about, and it shows all the time. So, Jim, good to be back with you. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. Do subscribe to the podcast if you don't already. Tell your friends about us as well. Thanks for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a terrific Monday. Join us again on Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.